left to die alone, the little black girl. Wept until the most feared black gunslinger fed her, a desolate whisper of wind, carrying the dust of forgotten promises and the scent of parched earth, coiled around the small, trembling figure. It was not merely a whisper. It was the world's mournful sigh, a lament for innocence forsaken. She lay curled, a knot of despair, beneath the skeletal silhouette of a dying oak, its gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers towards a merciless sun. Her cries had long since withered into dry, silent sobs, each one a tremor through her tiny frame. Her dress, once a cheerful yellow, was now a tattered canvas of dirt and faded hope, clinging to skin stretched taut over fragile bones. This was the landscape of abandonment, where shadows lengthened like the creeping tendrils of death, and the only sound was the frantic thrum of a child's own terrified heartbeat against the vast, indifferent quiet. The sun beat down, an unblinking eye of judgment, baking the very air she breathed, stealing the last vestiges of moisture from her cracked lips. She dreamed of water, a cool, sweet balm, but only the dust devils danced mockingly across the barren expanse. This was not a place for the living, certainly not for one so small, so utterly alone. The world had turned its back, a collective shrug of shoulders, leaving her to face the gnawing emptiness that mirrored the hollowness in her belly. Hunger was a sharp, insistent pain, but thirst was a dry, burning agony that promised a quicker, more agonizing end. Her vision blurred. The distant horizon wavered, a cruel mirage of escape. She was a forgotten stain on the earth's rough hide, a testament to a cruelty so profound it defied the very notion of humanity. And then, a shadow fell, not from the sun, but from something vast and imposing, a silent sentinel blotting out the punishing light. It was a shape that promised neither salvation nor swift demise, but rather an unknown, a terrifying question mark in a world that had offered only bitter answers. The dust settled around her, a fine, ghostly powder, as if the land itself was holding its breath, awaiting an inevitable reckoning. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The shadow belonged to a man, tall and lean, etched against the blinding glare like a figure carved from obsidian. His hat, a wide-brimmed sentinel of his identity, dipped low, obscuring eyes that were rumored to hold the cold emptiness of graves. This was Jericho, the gunslinger, a name whispered in saloons and farmhouses alike, a name synonymous with swift, unyielding justice, or perhaps, simply, with death. He moved with a predatory grace, each step deliberate, kicking up small puffs of dust that dissolved instantly into the parched air. His duster, worn from countless journeys and whispered encounters, billowed slightly with his stride, a dark shroud against the oppressive brightness. He carried the weight of unspoken stories, of battles fought and lives extinguished, a heavy burden that seemed to seep into the very ground he walked upon. The girl, barely registering his presence beyond the sudden abatement of the sun's merciless gaze, stirred weakly, her eyes fluttering open, revealing irises the color of burnt umber, filmed over with the dust of her despair. She saw not a man, but a silhouette, a monstrous outline that promised either a quick end to her suffering or a new, incomprehensible terror. There was no warmth in his posture, no softening of the hard lines of his body. He simply stood, a monument to solitude, observing the small, pitiful form with an inscrutable stillness. His hand, resting lightly on the worn grip of the pistol holstered at his hip, was a testament to his profession, a silent threat that hung in the air like the heavy, metallic tang of an approaching storm. Yet something in the stillness of the child's suffering seemed to snag at the edges of his hardened periphery. It was a familiar ache, a ghost from a past he had long buried under layers of iron will and gunpowder. The air around them thrummed with an unarticulated tension, a silent standoff between desperate vulnerability and an ingrained, almost reflexive, indifference. He had seen countless scenes of human suffering, had inflicted some himself, yet this silent, weeping desolation held a different, unsettling resonance. The girl coughed, a dry, rasping sound that tore at the quiet, and in that small, desperate noise, something shifted within the gunslinger, a faint tremor in the stone edifice of his self-control. His hand, calloused and scarred, moved, not towards the pistol but slowly, almost hesitantly towards the satchel slung across his shoulder. The girl watched, her breath hitched, a fragile bird caught in the gaze of a predator. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to flee, to vanish into the dust, but she possessed no strength to even crawl. The movement was so unexpected, so contrary to the whispers of his legend, that it froze her in a moment of bewildered apprehension. Jericho pulled out a piece of jerky, dried and tough but undeniably food, and a small, dented canteen. The sight of the water, a shimmering promise in the harsh light, was almost too much for her parched throat to bear. He knelt slowly, his movements still precise, controlled, but without the usual tension that accompanied his every step. There was no kindness in his face, not yet, only a grim, almost reluctant acknowledgement of her existence. He offered the jerky, holding it out with a hand that had pulled triggers and ended lives, a hand now extended in a gesture so incongruous it felt like a dream. She hesitated, her small, dirty fingers trembling as they reached out, hesitant, unsure if this was a trick, a cruel mirage. Her stomach rumbled, a pitiful, loud protest against days of emptiness. When her fingers brushed against the rough meat, a spark ignited in her eyes, a flicker of life returning to their depths. She snatched it, tearing at it with a desperate, almost animalistic hunger. He uncorked the canteen, the faint gurgle of water a symphony to her ears, and offered it. Her eyes, wide and pleading, met his for the first time, holding a silent question, a desperate plea that cut through his practiced detachment. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable, as she drank, long, shuddering gulps, the water tracing clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. She was just a child, no more than 6 or 7, a fragile wisp of a being. He thought of his own past, of the biting hunger and the stark indifference of a world that had offered him nothing but cold steel and colder stares. This girl, this moment, was a mirror, reflecting an emptiness he knew too well, an echo of a vulnerability he had long since purged from his own being, or so he believed. The jerky, tough as it was, yielded slowly, offering sustenance, a sliver of hope. She ate, utterly consumed by the primal act, oblivious to the feared man kneeling before her, seeing only the giver of life. The world had not always been so desolate for Jericho. Once, long before the dust became his constant companion and the pistol his only confidant, there had been another life, a different name. He had been a boy, just a few years older than the girl now chewing on the last remnants of his jerky when the fire came. It had consumed his home, not with a sudden roar but with a slow, creeping malice, fueled by the hatred of those who saw his family's small patch of land, their meager success, as an affront. He remembered the shouts, the acrid smell of smoke, the terrified screams of his mother, the desperate, futile resistance of his father. He had watched from the tall grasses, hidden, helpless, as the flames devoured everything he knew, everything he loved. The men who rode away, their faces masked by shadow and malice, had left him with more than just orphaned grief. They had etched an indelible mark of injustice onto his very soul. That night, beneath a sky choked with ash, a different kind of hunger had taken root in him, a hunger for retribution, for a power that would ensure he would never again be so utterly vulnerable, so completely at the mercy of others. He learned quickly, ruthlessly, that the world respected only strength, that kindness was a luxury for those who could afford it. He sought out the outcasts, the skilled, the dangerous, learning their ways, honing his instincts, transforming the boy who wept in the ashes into the man who dealt in lead and fear. Each notch on his gun, each life taken, was not a celebration of violence, but a grim tally against the injustices that had stolen his past. He had become a ghost, haunting the fringes of society, his reputation preceding him, a shield against further hurt, a weapon against those who would inflict it. He had convinced himself that he was beyond emotion, a vessel of cold calculation, driven by a solitary, unyielding purpose. But the small, vulnerable figure before him, her eyes still wide with a mix of hunger and fear, stirred a memory, an ancient wound that refused to truly heal. It was the irony of his existence. The man who had embraced death to escape the clutches of powerlessness now found himself staring at the purest form of powerlessness, a mirroring of his own lost childhood. He rose slowly, the ache in his knees a reminder of his own mortality, a slight grimace touching his lips. The girl, now sated, looked up at him, her eyes clearer, a flicker of curiosity replacing the terror. He had to keep moving. Lingering in one place was a luxury he couldn't afford. But the image of her, so small, so utterly adrift, held him. It was a silent challenge to the very essence of his chosen path. He could leave her. It would be simple, a return to the detached existence he had carefully cultivated. Yet something refused to let him turn away. Perhaps it was the echo of his own desperation, a ghost of the boy he once was, reflected in her gaze. He made a guttural sound, something between a sigh and a grunt, and began to walk, not away from her, but parallel to the path she had been abandoned on. He didn't invite her, didn't beckon, but his stride was deliberately slow, a silent invitation, a test. For a moment she remained still, watching his retreating form, a tiny figure against the vast, unforgiving landscape. Then, as if a thread had been drawn between them, she pushed herself up, her small legs wobbly, and stumbled after him. Her steps were tentative at first, then gained a desperate urgency, as if fearing he would vanish like a mirage. She followed, a tiny shadow trailing a larger one, across the desolate plains. They encountered no one for hours, only the relentless sun and the whispering wind. But the journey was not truly empty. It was filled with the silent tension of their unspoken arrangement, the gradual, almost imperceptible shift in the emotional landscape between them. Each stumbling step she took, each time she fell and scrambled back up without complaint, chipped away at the hardened shell around Jericho's heart. He didn't look back often, but he was always aware of her presence, a faint rustle of her tattered dress, the soft pad of her bare feet on the dusty ground. He was a lone wolf, and she was a tiny lost lamb, somehow tethered to his side. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with dangers both seen and unseen. But for the first time in a long while, Jericho felt a different kind of burden, one that was not solely about vengeance or survival, but about a fledgling, terrifying responsibility. Days bled into a week, then two, the rhythm of their unlikely journey becoming a silent language. Jericho maintained his aloofness, speaking only when absolutely necessary, his words terse, clipped. Yet, his actions spoke volumes. He shared his meager rations, always ensuring she ate first. He found sheltered spots for them to rest, always positioning himself between her and the open, vulnerable expanse. He taught her, without preamble, how to identify safe water sources, how to tell edible berries from poisonous ones, how to stay low when danger approached. He watched her, his gaze intense, assessing, almost clinical, yet beneath that scrutiny lay a burgeoning awareness, a subtle shift in his hardened interior. She, in turn, slowly shed her fear, replaced by a quiet trust that was both fragile and profoundly unsettling to him. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture, the slight tightening of his jaw that signaled caution, the almost imperceptible relaxation that meant safety for now. One evening, huddled around a small, smokeless fire, her eyes wide with innocent curiosity, she asked him, "Why do people fear you?" The question hung in the air, a stark, unfiltered truth. Jericho stiffened, his hand unconsciously drifting to his pistol. He offered no answer, only a deepening of the shadows in his eyes. She didn't press, merely nodded, accepting his silence as an answer in itself. Her simplicity was a sharp contrast to the complexities of his world, a world where fear was currency, and power was bought with blood. This stark purity, this innocent acceptance, chipped away at his carefully constructed defenses. He saw not a burden, but a reflection, a poignant reminder of a part of himself he believed long dead. He found himself protecting her instinctively, a primal urge he hadn't known he possessed. He would catch himself watching her sleep, a small, peaceful bundle, and an unfamiliar warmth unsettling in its intensity, would unfurl in his chest. It was a dangerous warmth, a vulnerability he had sworn off, yet it persisted, stubbornly refusing to be extinguished by his cold resolve. He was Jericho, the feared gunslinger, but now he was also something else, something softer, something he didn't yet have a name for. The fragility of their peace was shattered with the sunrise. They had camped near a small, isolated ranch, hoping for respite, for a few hours of undisturbed quiet. But the world had a way of finding Jericho, of pulling him back into its grim dance. 3 riders appeared on the horizon, their forms silhouetted against the nascent light, growing steadily larger, faster. They were the kind of men Jericho knew intimately, hard-faced, desperate, and armed, with the unmistakable swagger of those who believed themselves untouchable. One of them, a hulking brute named Silas, was a ghost from Jericho's past, a man whose gang had been dismantled by Jericho's cold steel years ago, a vendetta simmering just beneath the surface of his crude humor. Silas carried a grudge like a badge of honor, and the moment his eyes fell upon Jericho, recognition and then a chilling glee ignited in them. "Well, well, if it ain't the Black Shadow himself," Silas sneered, pulling his horse to a skidding halt, his men fanning out, their hands resting suggestively on their own weapons. "Heard you were dead. Guess the devil spat you back out." Jericho remained motionless, his hand hovering near his own gun, his eyes flicking from Silas to his men, assessing the threat, the angles, the inevitable outcome. The girl, sensing the shift in the air, the sudden palpable tension, instinctively pressed herself against Jericho's leg, a small, trembling anchor. Her presence was a complication, a vulnerability he could not afford. Silas's eyes narrowed, falling upon the girl. A cruel smile stretched across his face, revealing stained teeth. "And who's this little sparrow, Jericho? Your new pet? Thought you preferred solitude, not baggage." The word hung in the air, laced with disdain, a direct challenge not just to Jericho's life, but to the fragile, unspoken bond that had formed between them. The air crackled with a silent threat, a storm gathering force. Jericho's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He had faced down countless men, but never with an innocent life clinging to his side. This was a different kind of fight, one where the stakes were immeasurable, and his usual cold calculations might not be enough. The past had returned, not just to haunt him, but to directly threaten the one fragile light he had allowed into his shadowed existence. "She ain't nothing to you." Jericho's voice was low, a rumble of thunder before the storm, devoid of the usual cold indifference, imbued instead with a dangerous edge. Silas scoffed, dismounting with a heavy thud, his men following suit, forming a menacing semicircle. "Everything out here is for the taking, Jericho, especially if it bothers you." He took a step closer, his eyes glinting with a perverse pleasure at the flicker of something akin to fear in the gunslinger's gaze. Not fear for himself, but for the girl huddled behind him. The other 2 men fanned out, their hands straying to their holsters, their expressions grim and predatory. This wasn't just about a past grievance. It was about power, about breaking the man who had once broken them. Jericho knew this dance. He had led it countless times, but the girl, clutching his duster, was an untuned instrument in this deadly symphony. He couldn't risk a stray bullet, a clumsy move. His mind raced, calculating trajectories, assessing weaknesses, but always with the added variable of the innocent life he was now responsible for. Silas drew his own pistol, a heavy, nickel-plated monstrosity. "Let the girl go, Jericho, this ain't her fight." The implied threat was clear: stay in the way, and she would suffer. The choice was stark, brutal. Surrender her, and live to fight another day, or protect her, and risk both their lives. It was the moment of truth, the crucible where his hardened resolve met the nascent tenderness he had unknowingly allowed to take root. He had always been defined by his solitude, his ability to walk away from anything that might tether him. But looking down at the small, vulnerable hand clutching his coat, he knew he couldn't. This was the pivotal moment, the confrontation that would define whether the man he had become was truly beyond redemption, or if a spark of humanity still flickered within the hardened shell. The air hummed with anticipation, the silence broken only by the distant caw of a crow, a harbinger of the violence about to erupt. Silas lunged first, a wild, guttural roar erupting from his throat, aiming his massive fist at Jericho's head. It was a crude, desperate move, born of rage rather than skill, but it forced Jericho to act. He pushed the girl roughly behind a small, weathered water trough, whispering a single, urgent command: "Stay down," before sidestepping Silas's blow with a fluidity that belied his hardened exterior. The first shot rang out from one of Silas's men, tearing through the air, sending dust erupting where Jericho had just stood. The familiar symphony of violence began. The metallic click of hammers, the sharp crack of gunfire, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the morning air. Jericho moved like a shadow, drawing his own pistol with a speed that was almost supernatural, a blur of motion. His aim was precise, deadly. One of Silas's men crumpled, a silent heap, a testament to Jericho's lethal efficiency. Silas roared in frustration and lunged again, but Jericho was already beyond him, grappling with the other man, their forms dissolving into a flurry of fists and curses. The girl, peeking from behind the trough, watched in terrified fascination as Jericho, the man who had silently fed her, transformed into a whirlwind of controlled violence. He moved not with rage, but with a cold, terrifying efficiency. Each strike, each dodge calculated, but the numbers were against him. Silas, recovering, drew a knife, its blade glinting wickedly in the harsh sunlight, and charged from behind. It was a desperate, chaotic dance, a fight for survival where the slightest misstep meant death. Just as the knife lunged towards his back, a desperate, almost primal roar tore from Jericho's throat. He spun, not towards Silas, but towards the girl, shielding her instinctively with his own body, taking the glancing blow meant for her. The blade sliced across his arm, a searing pain, but his eyes never left Silas, never wavered from his deadly purpose. This was not just about survival. It was about safeguarding the fragile life that had found an unexpected haven with him. The world narrowed to this single brutal exchange, the past and present colliding in a crescendo of violence. The immediate threat dissolved into a stillness more profound than the dawn that had preceded it. The dust began to settle, revealing the grim tableau. One of Silas's men lay still. Another groaned, clutching a shattered arm, and Silas himself, disarmed and bleeding, lay pinned beneath Jericho's boot, his eyes wide with a fear that finally eclipsed his hatred. The knife, dropped in the struggle, lay embedded in the earth beside his head, a stark symbol of his defeat. Jericho stood over him, his chest heaving, the wound on his arm a jagged, weeping line of crimson against his dark skin. He said nothing, his face a mask of exhaustion and residual fury. But the message was clear, chilling in its unspoken brutality. He was the survivor, the unyielding force. Then his gaze softened, just imperceptibly, as he looked towards the water trough. The girl emerged slowly, her eyes wide, her small body trembling, but she was unharmed. She didn't cry, didn't scream, but looked at him with an awe that cut deeper than any blade. She had seen the monster he could be, the raw, brutal power, yet she clung to the image of the man who had protected her. He lowered his foot from Silas, a silent dismissal, and turned his back on the defeated men, a gesture of absolute contempt. He walked towards the girl, his movements stiff, the adrenaline fading, leaving behind a dull ache in his bones and a throbbing pain in his arm. He knelt, wincing slightly, and pulled her into a rough embrace, a gesture so uncharacteristic, so fraught with the weight of his own flawed existence, that it felt like a tearing of his very soul. He held her tight, a desperate, unspoken promise. He had faced his demons, not just the physical ones, but the internal battle between his ingrained solitude and this new, terrifying connection. In that embrace, the hardened shell around his heart fractured further, not shattering entirely, but yielding enough to let a sliver of genuine, protective love seep in. The world was still harsh, still unforgiving, but for this moment, in the quiet aftermath of violence, a fragile hope unfurled, a nascent belief that even a man forged in darkness could find a flicker of light in the most unexpected of places. The silence that followed the confrontation was not empty, but heavy with the weight of what had transpired. Jericho, his arm now crudely bandaged with a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt, led the girl away from the scene of violence, leaving Silas and his injured men to their fate. There was no joy in victory, only a grim sense of continuation. He had done what was necessary, but the cost, though not visible on her small frame, was etched into his own soul. He found a secluded copse of trees offering a rare shade, and they rested. The girl, whose name he still did not know, had not spoken a word since the initial whispers of fear, but her small hand found his, clutching it with a surprising strength. It was a silent affirmation of trust, a bond forged in the crucible of shared terror and unexpected protection. Jericho looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing beyond the dirt and the tattered clothes, seeing a resilient spirit, a flicker of light that refused to be extinguished. He was a gunslinger, a man of violence, but in her eyes he saw a path he hadn't known existed. He had always believed he was destined for a solitary end, a final gunfight in some forgotten, dusty town, but her presence offered a different kind of future, one he hadn't dared to imagine. It was a future fraught with its own dangers, its own responsibilities, but also with a profound, terrifying hope. He was a flawed man, deeply scarred, morally ambiguous, but for her he would try to be something more. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a fleeting beauty against the harsh reality of their lives. It was not a happy ending, not yet, perhaps never fully so, but it was a beginning, a quiet promise whispered between a feared man and a forgotten child. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long, long time, Jericho felt a faint stirring within him, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. The little black girl, once left to die alone, now had a protector, a deeply flawed one, yes, but one who had chosen, against all his instincts, to fight for her, to feed her, and in doing so, perhaps to feed a long-starved part of himself.